it's Pat McCracken from Legislative Services. Julia Patton from Legislative Fiscal and I have put together a slideshow. I'll get it into presentation mode. And Chair Beatty, however you want to run things, we'd certainly take questions along the way, if that's acceptable to you.
Yes, Pat, I think that would be a good idea. This is supposed to be an interactive arrangement, and it's best to take the questions when they're right on someone's mind. So please proceed, and I'll ask our host to be looking for raised hands.
All right. The first thing on the agenda, I've got a couple of slides. I know some of these are wordy and perhaps hard to read on screens. I know a PDF has been or will be posted to the OBPP task force webpage. This is an issue that Mr. Melton brought up previously about GTB and the GTB lag issue that did negatively impact property taxes this year in FY24. The GTB lag issue is not unknown. It's just that this unprecedented increase in taxable value for 24 made the lag more of an issue. And it's a little bit difficult to explain, but I tried to do it on our old GTB slide here. What you got to imagine, and remember, the gray columns are sort of an individual school district's, you could think of it as their revenue generating capacity. You could think about it as their mill value. We've got widely varying mill values, property wealth per kid, or I'm going to shorthand that to per A and B in every district. And GTB, basically, you draw a line and you fill all the low wealth districts up to that line as an equalization measure. What happens is when taxable values go up, every district, well, most districts that have taxable value increases will appear wealthier because their number of kids, their budget is not necessarily increasing, but their wealth is. And so these gray columns climb up and the line climbs up as well. However, because of the lag, the size of the GTB subsidy per mill remains the same. And so you got a larger hole with a smaller GTB patch from the prior year. It's the GTB lag. So what that meant was that even though we've been increasing the GTB multiplier and raising that solid dark line from the previous slide in these years, because of the GTB lag, we actually had a drop in total GTB paid. Again, these are statewide numbers, and every district gets impacted a little bit differently. But you can see that we had this trend of GTB increasing as the multiplier increased, property taxes remaining stable until we hit the anomalous year 24, and which we actually had a decrease. And this is what Mr. Melton pointed out a month or so ago, a significant decrease in GTB, total GTB paid out to school districts, and a corresponding increase in local property taxes, even in a year when the multiplier was climbing fairly significantly. That's the bad news. I put it in red. The good news is the lag corrects itself, and we will be seeing an increase in GTB. These are projected numbers from the model. And again, every district is impacted differently. These are statewide. We're going to be seeing an increase in GTB paid out, and we're going to drop property taxes back to about where they were prior to the anomalous year. I might pause there in case there's any questions or comments. And I guess maybe I'll finish up by saying there are some thoughts about how we might address this in the GTB formulas, in order to avoid this dynamic happening again, it could involve trying to basically eliminate the lag by using current year taxable values and GTB area in the formula.
Any questions for Pat at this point?
I raised my hand electronically, Mr. Chairman. I'll unraise it and just make a quick comment. And something that if you went back behind FY22 back to FY17, you would find that the legislature took some really significant steps. So I'm grateful for where we're at right now, and not so much troubled by FY24. It's more a matter of making sure that what the legislature appropriates in the context of property tax relief goes for property tax relief in the context of the discussion in this committee and the overall committee that we're part of. But to give you an idea of how well the legislature has done with the GTB formula, in FY17, general fund budgets were $166 million less than they are today, and property taxes were still $134 million. Put another way, out of all that growth since FY17 at $166 million per year, taxes only went up about 10 million. Take the blip off the radar from the current year, and that shows what happens when you raise the GTB multiplier from 198%, which is where it was sitting since I started at MTSBA, I believe, all the way up to 262% today. And that was part of a very deliberate action taken at a time when you were dissolving the age-old block grants that were frozen in place for 20 years and were highly inequitable and were a lawsuit waiting to happen. So I guess I just want to say kudos. It's pretty good work there. But my premise here is not that anybody did anything wrong or that that there's any fundamental flaw in the formula, only that even with the GTB next year as projected on this slide, the combination of the two-year total is still about $20 million less than what was included in K-12 base aid in House Bill 2 adopted by the legislature to fund this program. So it was in line with the fiscal note on House Bill 15 that projected about $260 and $290 million instead of the 249 and the 279 that we're going to see. So that's the end of my soapbox. I don't mean to suggest that there's anything wrong, only that if we want to, in the context of our charge for this subcommittee and the overall committee, this is low-hanging fruit for ensuring that money that's appropriated by the legislature for a particular purpose makes it to its destination.
Thank you, Mr. Melton. Any other comments or questions? I'll leave it to our host to identify those. I don't see any. Pat, go ahead and proceed.
All right. And thanks for those comments, Lance, or Mr. Melton. You're making me regret not drawing this chart out back to 2017, because it's exactly as Mr. Melton described. The next topic that I was told to prepare some information on was this administrative unification kind of topic. And the next several slides are going to talk about the existing statutory levers, a possible mechanism for encouraging K-12 districts, which and then reducing mill variability and increasing equalization. I think you guys, the subcommittee and maybe the task force as a whole has, been told the number of school districts we have and the breakdowns on that. Just real quick, this particular map is showing in the kind of gold here, the K-12 districts where we've got elementary and high school districts with contiguous boundaries that statutorily need to just become a unified K-12. And then elsewhere we've got typically more than 2 or more elementary districts that then become a high school district, a larger high school district. We'll look at some maps later today that I think will make that more clear. Real text heavy slide here for you. I'm not going to read it, but in terms of the existing statutory mechanisms that we have a mechanism called non-isolated status. It's a little counterintuitive. Every other school is considered isolated. Every other district is considered isolated. Helena, Billings, etc. What non-isolated means, and I kind of tried to cut to the chase in the italics here, is that it's a very small school that is not that geographically far from another school of another district. So it reflects perhaps local choice more than absolute necessity. And so therefore, and again, this is existing statute, local taxpayers pay more of those costs. You could look at it as an incentive to at least consider consolidation. But again, other states have formulas that include provisions for small but necessary schools. You could think of, I always think of Garfield County in Jordan. There has got to be a school and a high school in Jordan. There's no alternative. But this is about where we've got within, say, 20 driving miles, 2 schools, one of which has, as you can see, very low A and B, 9 or fewer. What I point out here is we've got a similar mechanism for high school districts, slightly higher A and B threshold of 25, but there's no financial mechanism that requires those non-isolated high school districts or schools to pay half of their direct state aid. The other mechanism that currently exists is what I call the consolidation annexation bonus. And this is that when 2 districts do decide to consolidate or go through an annexation, they get a period of time where they're each are allowed to basically retain in what's going to be a new unified budget, an additional basic entitlement or a portion thereof of that basic entitlement, as you can see in years 4, 5, and 6. And I was not around when this provision was added, but it seems to me that it's about providing something of a soft financial landing when districts choose to consolidate or annex. And it may preclude or delay closing schools or laying off employees. Maybe I'll just pause there real quick and see if there are any questions or move on.
Go ahead and proceed, Ted.
So the second topic under this administrative unification topic was, and these are ideas I think that percolated maybe from the Equity and Fairness Subcommittee, but because they were school related, came into this subcommittee. This idea that if K-12 districts are a more efficient operation, how might we incentivize the creation of those? Simplest way would be to provide an additional budgetary allowance for them, and especially if that increased budget was provided entirely by the state. So it wouldn't be a local property tax impact. It would be a little bit more money provided by the state. The final topic under administrative unification has to do with reducing mill variability. And I think the idea here is that perhaps in some circumstances, districts exist more for tax advantages than necessarily for educationally relevant factors. Additionally, the Constitution charges the legislature with distributing equitably the state's share of the cost. Equalization is in some ways never a bad thing in education when you're additionally guaranteeing constitutionally the equality of educational opportunity. The following slides are going to be several maps. I'll walk through each of them. I've added some text to this slide, so if somebody's looking later, they can be a little more oriented to it. As Mr. Melton mentioned earlier, base mill equalization has been greatly enhanced since about 2017. And as Mr. Melton said, that had to do with the elimination of the block grants and increases in that GTB multiplier that we were looking at on that previous slide. You have had information provided to you before that there are a whole lot of school property taxes outside of the school district general fund in areas like transportation, debt service, tuition, building reserve, et cetera. I'm not mentioning retirement because remember, retirement is not a district levy, it's a countywide levy. Over base property taxes in the school district general fund are another significant source of variation. This base mill equalization was kicked around by the 2015-2016 School Funding Interim Commission, otherwise known as the decennial study, the decennial school funding study. I think most of you are aware that that decennial study will kick in again next interim. But back in 2015-16, they were looking at this as well, and ways that you could further enhance base mill equalization would be continuing to ramp up that GTB multiplier, or alternatively equalizing the base funding needs at the county level and then providing county GTB, which is a whole lot like we do for school retirement costs. Alternatively, you could look at state funding to eliminate the base mills entirely and equalize statewide. And the funding for that could come from a number of different sources, including increasing the 95 mills, the 95 equalization mills, again, to enhance equalization. All right, I'll click into a map. These are going to be, there's going to be some data on these maps. It's probably impossible to read. It's kind of difficult even on the printout. And I guess the other thing that I wanted to mention, two things. One, a big thank you to Dan Kaiser, our data analyst in this office, for putting these maps together on the fly. Think of these as sort of teasers. What Dan and others with GIS skills can develop are web-based interactive maps that would allow you to click on the district, see the district name, see a host of other information about that district, and try to unpack why we've got this variation going on. So if the committee is interested in pursuing this mill equalization conversation, we can provide some even more robust tools for this. So this first map is showing just the K-12 districts, and that's if it's white space on these maps, it's because they're not the particular district that we're talking about, the type of district we're talking about. And that has to do with the fact that we've got overlapping jurisdictions with the elementaries and the high schools. The other thing that Dan added in here was a histogram to show kind of the distribution of base mills. So if we would have looked at a histogram like this or a scatter plot of base mills prior to 2017, there would have been much more variation. The increasing the GTB multiplier has meant that we've got more districts hovering pretty closely here. And I know it's impossible to read. So this scale goes from 4 mills on the left here to about 51 mils on the right. So most districts are hovering in the 35 to 45 range. The outliers we have, think about that GTB slide. Those are your districts that have incredible tax wealth, and it reflects low base mills. And these are going to be familiar districts to you. We've got Ennis and Big Sky. We've got, I'm pretty sure this is Bainville and Webo K-12 districts. What you might want to think about is when you see a very low mill district next to a relatively high mill district. So when you have the sharper contrast in neighbors next to each other, you know, there's probably something going on there. Like, I have a feeling this discrepancy has to do with non-levy revenues from oil and gas, and perhaps the presence of pipelines traversing Webo County. I'll move on. Here's your base mills for high school districts. Real quick, the range here, much smaller range, 0 to 19 mils. Again, the equalization of the last 7 or 8 years has really made a difference. You've always got some outliers. These are also probably going to be some relatively familiar, very low mill districts. And again, I would point out, it's when you've got discrepancies like this. I believe this is Lambert High School District with very low mills, and then you've got Savage and Ritchie High School districts with much higher base mills. And remember, base mills do not reflect local decisions. They are the formulaic required mills per the school funding formula. And I'll just real quick point out, again, probably not possible to read, but Dan included in this histogram standard deviation. So we've got a fairly low standard deviation of about 3 mils here. Again, we've had compression in the base mills in the last 6 or 7 years. Here's your elementary school districts then. Range 0 mils to 35 mils, standard deviation of 7.5. Again, if you want to pursue this, some of the interesting ones are going to be, again, where you have very low mills next to significantly higher mills. So that's base mills. In the school district general fund budget, formulaic, required, and remember that split between local property taxes, base mills, and GTB in the diagram that we've showed you previously about school funding. GTB is what keeps a low wealth district's base mills from going through the roof. GTB works. The increases in the multiplier have worked to compress things pretty well in the base. The next 3 slides are going to be total mills. So we're starting with K-12 again. And total mills is, you know, you need to unpack that a little bit. It's going to include, it's not going to include retirement. Again, retirement is a county-wide mill. These are district mills. But it's going to include both your base and your overbase in the general fund, transportation, technology, tuition, building reserve, and debt service. So and bus depreciation. So sometimes when you see very high mills, it might be in part due to a district that's built a new school and is paying off the bonds through debt service levy on those. It can also be where we have really low wealth. And when you have really low property, when you have a really low mill value, it just takes a very high number of mills to raise the same amount of money. High school districts. I think what jumped out to me on this one, and I think that maybe Representative Jones has shown a slide that kind of gets at the bizarre boundaries between Melstone Elementary and Melstone High School. That's this Melstone High School right here between Roundup to the west and Forsyth on the east. We'll take a look at that at the next slide. But again, it's where you have these neighbor discrepancies. Also on these, it's important to acknowledge we've got some serious outliers that skew everything. And that could be addressed in subsequent iterations of these maps. Scale here is 0 to 447 mil, or no, excuse me. I think 250 mils. And here's your elementary districts. Scale 0 to 447. Massive outlier here, skewing the data pretty hard. You can see there's a lot of concentration, but this is in a range from 0 to 200 mils. Kind of the same story. And now you can see, because of the way Melstone's boundary changes to encompass at the elementary level a much larger area, you've got greater equalization of those base mills between those several elementary districts in there. So boundary discrepancies also make a difference. Mr. Chairman, that's the end of the topic on administrative unification. I know I kind of went into these maps. They're complicated a little bit. I'll pause there before sending it over to Julia, I believe, for the next agenda item.
Thank you, Pat. Are there any questions for Pat right now?
Mr. Chairman, can I make another comment?
Please.
So this is Lance Melton. As I look at these issues, first of all, it's great information and important information for us to be aware of. I think that some of the additional things that we need to be cognizant of is that on a statewide basis, there are 7 people per square mile. And when you think about our 7 largest communities, maybe even our 15 largest communities, having close to probably a couple of thousand people per square mile, it makes it all the more accentuated how rural and isolated so much of a portion of our state is. And I think that that having an awareness of that as we think about how you might incentivize or even encourage whatever we're talking about in the nature of consolidation should be with an awareness that there are places like Liberty County where there are 2 people per square mile and 3 antelope per square mile. And so I'm a big fan of preserving local control, particularly access to elected officials who are accountable to the people that they serve and nearby, so that they are aware of the impact of their decisions and can be reached easily to provide input. And I also think that as a result, letting equity make the determination as to who decides to continue to exist is the best way forward. Put another way, I think that if we ensure that the tax system is equitable among districts, which is the constitutional charge of the legislature to ensure not just its own share, but to ensure equality of educational opportunity. And the court held in Helena Elementary that goes all the way down to the local level. If we solve that issue, or at least better equalize even further than the legislature has already impressively done over the last 8 years, then we don't have to decide who is there for their tax relief and who's there for the kids. They'll find their own way to the finish line. In other words, if you're sitting there because you've got a little tax pocket here, a little tax haven, and that's the only reason that your district continues to survive, the only oomph behind the existence of that district, then if you take away that advantage by equalization, those individuals will no longer have the passion associated with perpetuation of that district, and it will go away. And I think if you look over the past several decades, that's kind of what's happened. The other thing I'd point out on these sort of idiosyncratic boundaries is that that typically happens at a time of transition. So most of those unique boundaries, the Joliet and Laurel have another one of them out there that you could look at that have this sort of chaotic overlapping jurisdiction, come as a result of the fallout from an annexation or a consolidation, and the discretion appropriately placed in the hands of the county commissioners, rather the county superintendent under the county commissioners, to figure that out. Where does that boundary go? How does the county superintendent then make sure that the boundaries are harmonized and described accurately, and there's actually substantial discretion under 20-6-103 for the county superintendent to make those sorts of decisions over time. But we've gone from over 3,000 districts back in the 1940s to really 320 administrative units today. I know we talk about districts, and there are districts when you're talking about tax jurisdictions, but Helena Public Schools is 2 districts, is the best way that I can describe that. And so if you count Helena Public Schools as a single administrative unit, we have about 320 of those. If you consider that to be 2 districts, we have about 400 of those. So I think that we're on the right track to be looking at equity among districts. And I would hope, just on behalf of public schools and the elected leaders I represent, that we let the chips fall where they may, rather than deciding from afar which districts get to continue to exist and which districts don't get to continue to exist. I think that the tax equity will sort that out just fine. Thank you.
Thank you, Lance. Are there any other questions or comments? Seeing none, just I have a couple takeaways from this in terms of committee work. It seems to me that that there are 3 different options that we might want to develop further. One is, as Pat pointed out earlier, we have the GTB lag issue, which I think was very well explained, a self-correcting situation, but one that is problematic when you have sharp spikes in taxable value across the state. So I think that I would recommend that we go forward and say, if indeed there is a way to ensure that we don't have the surprise that we had in 2024, I see no harm in pursuing that further and see how you would actually do that. The second thing I looked at was Pat pointed out, and it was on his slide with various columns describing the GTB area and the direct state aid component, et cetera. It's an interesting idea to provide more direct state aid to the K-12 districts. Of course, if we're to do that, it would seem to me that the bill payer would be almost necessarily be an increase or shift to income tax. I may be wrong on that, but I think that this particular idea merits going forward. Once again, this is not prescriptive, and listening to, I agree with Mr. Melton that in our local control state and under our Constitution, which provides a great deal of power to our school districts, we ought not be directing school districts to do things, but we ought to. We certainly can provide. Well, let's just say align funding in a way that promotes equalization across the board. So I think that particular option could be developed. I'd just like to see what the price tag is on it. And then finally, the last option is I think we should look a little bit further at too. And I don't know quite how to describe it. I wrote on my notes here, a county GTB for district-based funding is what I wrote down. I could be wrong on that. But basically, we're talking about equalization, not just statewide equalization, but an equalization with amongst school districts within a given county. Now, I think that that's probably much more complicated than it seems on its face. but does provide some, I think, some opportunities for better equalization and fairer treatment for all taxpayers within a given jurisdiction. So my plan, unless there's an objection, is to move forward with further developing those three options so that we can get to the point that we're beyond studying and actually looking at some specifics in terms of what it would take to implement the option, and also where the attendant tax shifts are going to be. I'm out of breath now, so I'll pause in case there's any questions.
Representative Beatty, I'll just come. This is Ryan with the budget office. Yeah, I think that all sounds great. Those are all super reasonable requests. Perhaps either before we wrap this meeting or certainly in a follow-up, we can maybe discuss what that might look like for either the next subcommittee meeting or even if it's available before the next meeting of the whole. Sometimes these are just almost top line, not official fiscal notes because there might not be a legislation, but conceptual fiscal notes, if you will.
Yes.
So happy to, yeah, those all sound reasonable. We can get that going.
Yeah, Ryan, I think probably because I think a lot of several details need to be worked out. What I would suggest is that if we're interested, unless there's objection, and I'm not hearing any from the committee, we'll go to staff after this, and I can meet with meet with you and the rest of the OPP staff and with our supporters from the legislature and from the Department of Revenue. And get these things fleshed out. I think that can be done. Probably, my target would be for the next committee meeting rather than for the meeting on the 22nd of April, where I think that we will probably be in a position just to report out on what we're looking to go forward with a few more details.
Certainly, sir. And I think just to give this group a little bit of context, there has been a few instances in a few of the other subcommittees now where this is exactly where we're at, where, as you know, what goes into fiscal notes are assumptions. And so even if there's some baseline assumptions, so you can see kind of some sensitivity analysis, if you will, we'll work with you on developing those assumptions so we can get, some dollar figures on some paper so we at least know what we're talking about.
Thank you. I think Pam, I see Pam's hand is up.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment, I guess, on the self-correcting the GTB. I guess I have to see what comes forward, but trying to fix spikes when there's an anomaly like we just went through sometimes is difficult to do, because at the end of the day, it may make it even worse down the road. So I just want us to be a little bit cautionary there. We're trying to fix something that's an anomaly, as we discussed at the beginning of our sessions. Has that happened in the past a lot, or is that just something that's happened because of these very high appraisals we have?
Thanks, Pam. I think you're spot on that, and I think that this truly was anomalous. I could, if Pat can pitch in, if he because he's looked at the history probably more deeply than I have, but the art of legislation is to fix problems and not create new ones. So you're exactly on in terms of how we should be looking at anything that we propose going forward. It needs to do something to address the problem that we're trying to get at and not break something else.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And then I guess I'll just need to learn more about how you talked about the county GTP. GTP at the county level, fixing the GTB at the county level. I guess I don't understand it enough to know on that. So hopefully we'll get more information on that. And providing more direct state aid, where would that money come from? Are we talking raising the mills?
So I think addressing your first point, yeah, this notion of countywide equalization is pretty complicated. I need more information on it too. It seems very appealing on the face of it, but I join you in sensing that I'm drinking from a fire hose, and we'll have a chance to what I'd like to do going forward is really flesh that out so you can see exactly what all the moving pieces are.
Okay.
With respect to the K-12 districts, I don't see Now that, I have to think my way through this one, but if we were going to increase the contribution to K-12 districts, I think that would be at the expense of income tax, but an increase in the income tax that must be used to supplement property tax that goes for base funding. I could be wrong about that, but that's my sense. I don't
Okay.
see this as requiring additional property tax levies. As a matter of fact, the intent is not to have additional property tax levies, but eventually, if you're going to do something, someone has to pay for it. And
Right.
and I think it would be, in this case, it would be a shift to income taxpayers. You know, virtually everything we're looking at here is going to be a shifting among property taxpayers or between property taxpayers and income taxpayers. Of course, some of those, oftentimes those are the same entities, but that's where we find ourselves.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Cindy Johnson has a question.
Go ahead, Cindy.
Thank you. My concerns are similar to Pam's, but more in regard to if the state budget intends to supplement combined school districts, those who already spend huge amounts per student, it doesn't seem right for those non-combined school districts which can't feasibly create a combined district, like those adjacent to Indian reservations. And so I just, having that conversation about combined versus non-combined is a concern for me also.
Yeah, thank you, Cindy. I think here are the devil's in the details, because certainly I'm hoping that we're going to be at a position where we could actually look at the impact on a county by county or district by district basis. I'm pretty hopeful that we'll be in a place to do that, so that we can see where there may be areas where this could be extremely detrimental. So once again, it's just the caution of as you do this sort of business, you got to make sure you're not breaking things in general, or there's casualties that you didn't anticipate along the way. Your point's well taken. Other comments or questions? Seeing none.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, just briefly, I uploaded some tax analysis of the OPI 2024 budget that goes across all of the funds that Pat has been discussing in his PowerPoint. And you may find some of that information useful if you want to download it from the chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Lance. And I would ask our host to please download that as well, and we'll take a look at posting that along with our meeting materials. Any other questions? Well, then let's proceed. I think we're on to Julia.
Thank you, Mr.
Yeah.
Chair. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, awesome. So for the record, Julia Patton with the Legislative Fiscal Division. I have a couple slides here, just as kind of a reminder of how the school equalization and property tax reduction account works. That's the SEPTR account, which was newly created through House Bill 587 as of 2023. And that receives revenue from the 95 mills. Next slide, please, Pad. So, and I apologize, the colors ended up a little lighter than I intended. I think PowerPoint swapped some colors out when we combined our deck, but hopefully it's still relatively readable. So the SEPTR account has a mechanism where when there are revenue increases from the 95 mills, 55% of the increase over the prior year triggers a reduction in local property taxes through some equalization mechanisms, basically by ramping up either the retirement GTB ratio or GTB-like mechanisms for state major maintenance aid and state debt service assistance. And so again, the 55% is in statute currently. The SEPTR account is the portion of law that is already active. So revenue from the 95 mills for fiscal year 2024 went into the SEPTR account. And the idea behind this 55% is that it helps maintain the balance between state and local funding for K-12, and then also the balance between state general fund, which is largely income tax, and property taxes. So then there's a portion of the law, which is that kind of dialing mechanism that will kick in fiscal year 2026. And there is a quote unquote hard-coded increase for fiscal year 2025 of about $33 million for retirement GTB. But starting in fiscal year 2026, so the first year of the next biennium, the dialing mechanism will kick in to be this automatic calculation where 55% of the increased revenue goes towards reducing local property taxes. And just as a reminder, if there's a reduction in revenue, again, not in mills, so if the mills were to drop to say 79, but still have an increase in revenue at half the rate of inflation, this would not kick in. So it has to be an actual reduction in revenue brought in by the 95 mills from the prior year. Then the dials turn backwards and shift the cost back onto local taxpayers. Next slide, please, Pad. So I was asked to create or to calculate some hypothetical scenarios regarding different numbers of mills and different dialing mechanisms. This looks like it's at 75%. So that 55% is fixed in statute. But theoretically, that 55% could be ramped up here to 75%. And then based on the different mill amounts, you can see the local property tax reductions above the current year. So everyone gets $33 million, that hard-coded increase in fiscal year 2025 on the left-hand side. And then if you're looking at the 95 mills fixed, it's kind of the upper gray line. I know those grays are pretty close, but it's the upper gray line. And that's kind of the trend as we would expect if we were to change that 55% to 75%, under the current number of mills. 95 mills, they're fixed. And then there are two other scenarios, one that kind of has two options. So the lower scenario, you have 79 mills, and you can either have a 79 mills fixed or 79 mills that float. And you'll notice that, again, they look pretty similar in fiscal year 2026. There's no increase. If the mills drop, the dialing mechanism doesn't kick in, at least very much. It's like maybe $1 million or something of local property tax reductions, which on a statewide basis is not a huge amount. But then you can see if the 75 or 79 mills were to remain fixed, you get some increased property tax relief at the local level compared to if the 79 mills float. And so one of the reasons that I chose to do the scenarios the way I did here, where the kind of changes kick in fiscal year 2026, is that for the purposes of this discussion, I think like any change in number of mills would really require legislative intervention. And so unless there would hypothetically be a special session, I'm assuming that legislative intervention would come in the 2025 session. And so that's kind of the assumption that I used to create these charts. So next slide, please, unless there are questions.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, go ahead, Lance.
I just want to point out that Helena Elementary found that when there was not a set number of mills like this, that the state was violating its obligation for equity due to excessive reliance on variable, non-voted and voted levies, and that the Montana Supreme Court, in its 7-0 decision, found that the argument that the mills should be reduced to 79 was not only inconsistent with law, but with the Constitution. Hate to keep poking a stick on the issue, but I want to make sure we understand the nature of the court's ruling in that regard and the predictable past circumstances that led to the creation. You can call it the adjustment because it wasn't the creation, but the increase in the uniform mills to avoid excessive reliance on local non-variable levies that depend upon the underlying tax wealth.
Thank you.
Okay.
Uh,
Now,
Before you move on, Julia, so this reflect the number, just so I'm clear on your graph, this reflects the reduction in district level correction.
yes, that is correct. So this is
This-
basically the House Bill 587 scepter account dialing calculation, the reduction in local property taxes from that mechanism that we would see under these different scenarios. And one of the things I didn't mention when I was speaking earlier is there's a fourth scenario here, which is 110 mils. And that just, there's nothing special about that number. It was just a number to show kind of what happens on the opposite end if instead of lowering the 95 mils, they were raised, and that increase in revenue was fed through the scepter account dialing formula, and how that would reduce local property taxes. Again, this is assuming 75% of the change goes towards reducing local property taxes.
Let's see, I think I see a hand. Pam.
Yeah, I guess maybe I'm misunderstanding this. You said the 110 mils would actually lower the property taxes, and I'm trying to understand that.
Yes. So again, the way the scepter account works is that any increase in revenue, a certain percentage of that, again, this is hypothetically 75%, but in current law, it's 55%. So if we were to raise the 95 mils to 110, let's say hypothetically, that's about $100 million difference in the 95 in revenue brought in by those mills. And so 75% of that, say 100 million. And again, these are super loose numbers. I'm just saying 100 million because the math's easy. 75 million of that would then be fed through either the retirement GTB formula or spill into then the major maintenance aid and debt service assistance, and would go back out to the local school districts, and therefore reduce local property tax collections from local school districts.
Voted mills.
Not necessarily voted mills. So for the retirement fund, those are really required mills.
Okay.
For major maintenance aid, that's the building reserve fund, which has both voted and non-voted mills. And then the debt service fund, yes, those would be voted mills.
But we're still going to be increasing property taxes on one end. I just got my 17 mil difference costs to me just as an individual with property in Flathead County. And that 17 mils equated to almost $642 per year. So if we go up to 110 mils, I'm assuming that would add another $400 or $500 onto that. But where am I going to see that? Where am I going to see the reduction, I guess, if I pay that $400 or $500 more? Does that mean the schools are going to get more money so they don't have to go out for levies? Or what does that mean?
Say, Julia, let me step in on this,
Go for it.
because this kind of drives towards a question I was going to pose. So the 110 mil option there is just thrown for illustration. Pam, you're absolutely right. Obviously, we're levying more property taxes, so there's going to be an increase due to that levy. Then there's a corresponding decrease in the local levies due to the scepter dial-in. But the other tax shift you're going to see, and Julia, I need you to correct me if I'm wrong on this, is that all of this money that coming in from 110 mils would be used to support either equalization in the GTP area or would go back in direct state aid. I guess that's a long way of saying is the balance would reduce the requirement for income tax money to supplement base aid for our schools.
So it will lessen income taxes, not necessarily property taxes.
Correct. There's a tax, once again, there's a
Right.
tax.
Yeah, it's a shift, right?
There's a couple of different shifts,
Yeah,
different shifts, but so then the value judgment is which do you prefer? You know,
Right.
a reduction in your income taxes or an increase in your property taxes, and those are the kinds of discussions we're going to have. And Julia, one thing I would say, I like this chart a lot. One thing we probably need to do is include a table that shows where the tax shifts would be in each of these and the amount. I think that would answer Pam's question and make it clear, because I keep on pounding this particular topic, but tax shifts are inevitable in most of the work, if not all of the work we're doing now. And so identifying them clearly is the next phase in developing this particular chart. I think there's another hand up, a couple more hands up. Pam, yours is still up. Are you done?
No, actually, I just want to follow up on that. So I'm sitting on a task force to lower property taxes and to try to explain to the average citizen out there that, well, I'm going to raise the mills and I'm going to charge you more, but in the end of the day, you're going to get less. It's just really something that's really difficult to explain to someone. And I just wanted to add that, because if you do, even if it's income tax, it's not the person that pays the property taxes may not get a benefit from the income tax side. So I think we have to be kind of careful where we go. Anyway, that's just a comment. Thank you.
And a quick response, Pam, on that, just so it's clear to anyone that is listening online. We are just looking at data now. We are not advocating for any particular option at all. We're just showing what in the universe of possible solutions, what it would look like if we took any one of these actions. So just want to be clear, no one is advocating, at least at this point, for raising the 95 mil levy, but it's possible that could come. But I agree with Pam. That would have to come with a very hefty explanation and a careful consideration of the relative impact on different property taxpayers.
I guess one more.
Yeah,
more
go
thing, if I
ahead,
may.
Pam, and Mr. Melton.
Yeah, I guess we won't really know a lot of how this is all going to work until the scepter takes effect. And I don't know if we can really figure that out here and figure out where we want to go until that takes effect, which is what, in next year? Does that take effect?
Yeah, and I guess I think we know enough though that we can see what the impact will be. I mean, we won't be able to see the actual dollars, but given a set of assumptions on taxable values and that sort of thing, I think it'll be clear that I think we'll have clear enough information to decide the worthiness of any changes we might make there. Lance, you've been waiting patiently.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, the spreadsheet I uploaded that can be analyzed, you can resort it by LE, which is column D, and you'll see that in Flathead County, for example, the base mills are higher than the statewide average. So roughly speaking, it all depends on what you do with those extra uniform state mills. If you use it to buy down the base mills for school districts, presumably districts in Flathead County would benefit by large measure. The statewide average elementary base mills are at 18, and in Flathead County, they're between about 20 and 30 something. And the high school base mills are comparably lower on a statewide average compared to what's going on in Flathead. So it all depends on where you place the revenue that comes in. And you could do that in one of two very easy ways that would have different results. One would be raise direct state aid, the percentage of direct state aid from 44.9 to whatever the additional revenue is that allows it to go upward. And that would provide relief to every district in the state that would displace the part of GTB, the portion of GTB that is between direct state aid and the base budget. We did that in 2001, actually the May 2000 in the special session, did it in collaboration with Senator Glazer and raised direct state aid from 40% of the maximum budget to 44.9, and that yielded $20 million of tax relief. Boom. So you either raise the direct state aid percentage or you raise the GTB multiplier, and you can ensure that all the revenue that comes in from those increased statewide mills goes to reduce the local variable mills that together represent about 160 million bucks, 162 point something million dollars. So as long as you place it back in the bucket to displace, then that shift that's going to occur is going to occur between high wealth, relatively high wealth areas versus low wealth areas from a property tax revenue standpoint.
Thank you. I think there may be one other question out there.
This is
Cindy?
Cindy Johnson, yeah. And in regard to Pam's question of how will my property taxes go down, wouldn't the property tax portion that's dedicated to retirement and transportation be the place where you'd see the relief?
Julia, why don't you take that one?
So yes, I think you're kind of getting at there would have to be some policy decisions made on how, if theoretically the mills were raised from 95 to 110 or whatever number, there would have to be some policy decisions made. Do the increase in the mills get fed through the GTB formula like this slide is showing? I mean, that's one option. You have another option to use those to bring all school districts up to base or to pay a greater portion of the base. Or, again, if they're being fed through the GTB formula, the dials in the SEPTA account, then yes, they're going to first go to retirement, then go to major maintenance, then go to debt service. And certain districts, because again, these mechanisms are either GTB or GTB-like, aren't necessarily sending that funding out in the same way that it was paid into the state. Districts with lower taxable values and higher numbers of kids are going to get more aid through those mechanisms than, say, if it was just distributed through the base, school funding formula through direct state aid.
So 55% of the increase in revenue would not necessarily flow back to the county that experienced that increase.
If it goes through GTB, yes, that's correct.
That would be unfortunate.
So are there other questions or?
I think we've exhausted, I think we've exhausted the questions. And they were good questions. Cindy, did you have another question? I see your hand still up.
No, I'm sorry. I forgot to lower my hand. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman, this is Lance.
Go ahead,
We just need to see the spreadsheets, because I can tell you that if you raise statewide mills and use it to decrease local variable mills in any populated center in Montana, the populated center in Montana is going to generally gain. And I think that when you see the spreadsheets, you'll know the numbers, and then you can, you won't have to debate the scenario. It'll be there in a spreadsheet.
Thank you. Julia, why don't you go ahead with your next slide?
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just, one of the slides got missed in the compiled deck, so I just pulled mine up. I will get this to Nancy at the budget office so that she can get this posted. But here, so we just talked about the 75%, which again is a hypothetical. Here is what it would look like under the current law, 55%. So the scales here are the same. Notice when I go back to 55%, that the amount of local property tax reductions decrease. And that's because, again, you're only sending 55% of the increase in whatever revenue is brought in by the 95, 110, 79, et cetera, mills. You're only taking 55% of that increase and using it to reduce local property taxes. The other 45% is using to kind of maintain that balance again between property tax and income tax from the state general fund. And so that's again kind of why I ran 3 different numbers. Again, there's nothing special about 75% or 35%, which is the third scenario, but the 55% is what's in current law. And so again, you've got your orange line here, which is your 95 mills fixed, which is basically what we're looking at. If there are no policy changes, this is what we'll see. The 55% is fixed in current law. 95 mills are, and again, when I say fixed, I'm not necessarily talking about, actually fixing the 95 mills. I know there's a banking mechanism, but for the purposes of what the state is actually levying, those 95 mills, at least for the short term, will stay at 95 until the banked mills run out. And so if you maintain that 95 mills fixed, you see you've got the orange line, that's the property tax relief that you'll see again year over year. above fiscal year 2024. If you bump up again to 110 mills, but you're only sending 55% versus 75% back through the scepter mechanisms, then you're going to get less local property tax reductions than you would at, say, 75% in this example. And then you can see again the 279 mil examples where you either have 79 mils fixed or 79 mils floating. And again, if the 79 mils float, because you're kind of growing at half the rate of inflation, there's not a huge increase in the local property tax reductions through 2029, because that total amount collected by those mills is staying relatively flat. Again, some small increases. So the third scenario that I took a look at was 35%. And this is close to what was originally included in law. It was an earlier version of House Bill 587. I think it was either 30 or 33 or 35%. It was approximately a third. And so this is what, again, those 4 different kind of mill scenarios would look like, with only about a third of the increase going back to reduce local property taxes. So again, you're just going to see the amount going back to lower property taxes is a little bit lower than in the other 2 scenarios, because it's only a third of the delta. And so again, these are really meant to be qualitative, kind of like, what does this look like when it happens? Don't read too much into the exact numbers of either the mills or the dollar amounts, because we have to make some assumptions for taxable value growth. And obviously, 79 mills was chosen because that was the value that the counties adopted, or very close to the value that the counties adopted last fall. But the 110 is just to show kind of the contrast of what happens when we swing to the opposite end of the spectrum, and those mills would be theoretically raised.
Julia, before you go on, I think it's important to emphasize a point that Julia just made, and that is, I asked her to put these together, making some assumptions in terms of taxable value change over time. It's my understanding that we'll have firmer projections in time for us to fine tune these. And Julie, if you could explain how that, what the timeline would be for that, and where, well, I'll just leave it at that. If you could explain when we might expect to have firmer taxable value projections.
Okay. So the Legislative Fiscal Division is currently working on the Outlook, which is a basically 4-year outlook, kind of focused on the upcoming biennium. So the 2027 biennium, which is fiscal year 2026 and fiscal year 2027, although we generally make those projections for 4 years, so through fiscal year 2029. That outlook is generally published in June. So we should have some updated taxable value and property tax forecasts coming in June. And then I believe in August, the Department of Revenue certifies the values, the taxable values for the upcoming property tax payments that go out in late October and November. And then so those August payment, or those August certified values, I don't know if they will be available. You'd have to double check with the Department of Revenue if they'll be available before the task force is complete with its work. And then the final kind of formal projection for next session, which is HJ2 or House Joint Resolution 2, that is adopted in November, which is after the task force will have completed its work. So probably our best projection, at least from the legislative branch, will be from the Outlook in June.
Thank you, Julia. So I'd like to make sure you coordinate with the Budget Office and with the Department of Revenue on that. The good news is we'll have reasonable estimates on taxable value in June. So whatever kind of modeling we do, we can update that accordingly. And just as important that we vet this with Department of Revenue and the Budget Office as we're going through it. This is a pretty normal process of development of these projections anyhow.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Go ahead and continue.
So that's all I have for those scenarios. I know it's a lot of data to throw at you. with, 4 different scenarios under 4 different, settings of the scepter dial. But I think Pat has some more slides, so I'm gonna stop sharing and let him resume sharing unless there are additional questions.
And if Pat is, and while Pat is uploading his slides, I think what we need to do to go forward with this is to flesh out what the actual tax shifts are in each of these cases. And I think there are some opportunities to look at where the state levy money is flowing in such a way that more of it goes to reducing local property taxes than even is possible under the scepter account. Mr. Melton kind of alluded to some of those possibilities. I think what's owed to the committee right now is we've whetted folks' appetite or interest in this. I think we need to flesh this out a bit more, explain the mechanics, and show explicitly what the various tax shifts are going to be. And if we can get to the point that we can do it on a district by district or county by county level, that would be great. More to follow on that. And with that being said, Mr. McCracken.
Mr. Chairman, I think the agenda was to bounce to Mr. Iverson's.
It's Mr. I see Mr. Iverson's here. This is I'm looking forward to hearing this presentation, so I'll turn it over to whomever is orchestrating it.
This is Dwayne. I don't know that, do we have the stuff to load up that model that was put together by Eric Dale?
Let me ask our host here, Budget Office, do you have that stuff ready to present?
I believe Eric has it.
Okay.
He developed an interactive model that would show at various mill levies what it would do and stuff. I think the first thing to understand really what this is presentation or what this is looking like. First, I gotta apologize. I'm in the middle of tax season, so I don't have a whole lot of time to work on it.
Hey, Dwayne, before you go any further, I just want to say, I think they said Eric had your model ready. Eric, did you have something that you wanted to put on the screen before Dwayne goes on?
I sure can if you think that would be helpful.
Sure.
Dwayne, I'll leave it. Dwayne, this is your show. I'll leave it to you. If you want him to put some stuff up,
Yeah, he can put it up, and then before we started, okay, as he's doing that, one thing to understand, like when you look at mills, okay, you take county and city budgets, it's whatever their budget is divided by taxable value. Schools are the only one that's a fixed number times taxable value generates more money. And what I was looking at here is if you want relief to Montana taxpayers, the only way we can do that is try to get money from out-of-state taxpayers. And so the method here is how could you go about doing that and stuff. And so that's what's the whole purpose of this is looking at. If we do reduction of mill levies, then we reduce the property tax we collect from out of state. It still takes the same money to run state government and schools and all that type of stuff. So it's just a matter where that shift's going to be. So what this is an attempt to do is to shift to where we get more money from out of state and relieve the Montana taxpayer. So if you want to go ahead, then Eric, you can explain your model a bit.
Sure. Do my best. So in talking with Mr. Iverson, we wanted to estimate sort of what some of the impacts would be of essentially increasing the statewide equalization mills and then rebating some portion of that increase back to taxpayers in various forms. So as part of this analysis, one of the things we looked at was rebating flat amounts to primary residents, similar to the rebates that went out this interim. So they were currently set at $675. So I calculated what the numbers would be if we change that on those rebate properties, essentially to whatever the committee or whomever was looking at this analysis deemed appropriate. Right now, this spreadsheet and this model is set to $750. So this is assuming that $750 would go out to all primary residents. And the way we estimated that population was essentially just to look at the people that applied for the $675 rebate. In addition to that, in talking with Mr. Iverson, he mentioned a desire to rebate some portion of the increase in equalization mills back to non-primary residents as well. And that's this next section of the model down here, basically. So I broke out everything that is the taxable value associated with non-primary residents here, and then rebated a portion of the increase in mills back to these properties. So currently, the additional mill revenue is set at 87.68 mills, and we'll come back to that amount in just a moment. But so this is assuming that we're rebating 110% of that increase in value back to these type properties. However, not all of that might necessarily go back to these properties, because that is further sort of modified by the portion of income that these properties have in Montana relative to their total income. And this is where there's some pretty heavy assumptions that should probably be taken with a grain of salt, but it's the best information we have. So in order to make these assumptions, I essentially went into the income tax records and got some averages for various types of properties and assumed those would be the same income apportionment factors that would be used in this analysis. So for class 4 residential property and class 4 commercial property that is not associated with a primary residence, looking at the income tax data, it appeared that approximately 89% of income was from Montana source income relative to all other types. So I used that apportionment factor to adjust these rebate amounts. Similarly, I broke out other types of property and looked at the corporate income tax apportionment factors for those types of properties and came up with an estimate. And so this is the amount that would be estimated to be rebated back to these properties. And then I looked at the summary down here. So this is the additional revenue that would essentially flow to the state based on the 87.68 mills. So under this scenario with these assumptions, the total rebates to primary residents would total $157 million. The total rebates to non-primary resident taxpayers would be $253 million, and there would be an additional $410 million in state revenue. And that nets out to approximately zero. So that 87.68 mills is the amount that was estimated to be approximately revenue neutral. If you change this to, say, 45 mills, then you would be rebating 156 million to primary residents, 130 million to all other taxpayers, and you would be generating an additional 210 million in revenue for a net loss to the state of 76.189 million, if that makes sense. This was developed at Mr. Iverson's request, and I think that's all I have to say at this moment, unless there are questions, which I can certainly take.
Yeah, Eric, I really appreciate what you did. The other thing for everybody to realize is the stuff that's in yellow there, that those factors, as you change those, it changes the number significantly. And so that's where we got to drill down as to how much of that would be rebatable property and on what percentage.
Correct.
All right, I'm sure there's several questions here. Let me take Pam first.
So just a question on this. If an individual has their primary residence, plus they have, say, a couple commercial buildings and some rental lots and all this other, maybe like 8 or 9 properties, they're going to pay a higher tax, but are they really going to get back the money that they've paid? And I don't, I guess I'm trying to understand the impact. It's still going to raise taxes on some that have maybe more than one property that are residents of the state. And how does that work?
Let me go through what the scenario is. This showed you how it works, okay? the first thing we gotta do is we create a TAP account at the state, and that's where we'd pay our property tax. And at that TAP account is where the relief number would be there. So that's where, when you go to pay your taxes, that relief would be sitting there, so you'd be paying a check that'd be less than it would have been before. Your residence would be reduced by the $750 or $675, whatever numbers picked to do that, okay? So the people with escrow, their escrow payments wouldn't go up because the reduced property taxes that are there. And so the TAP account's a critical thing to that, and it's so people can see that relief. They can't relate the check they received from before to the increased tax bill. And so that's where what they had paid would be reduced. That same would go for rental property and all of the commercial property, agricultural property, all the other classes would have that same thing. So that's where the whole thing's at. So with that, I was looking at, okay, we got an extra 16 mills because of the argument between the 79 and the 95, and I used those numbers also in my thoughts, okay? So I'm looking at maybe an additional 30 mills, something like that, which would result in rural districts going up maybe about 10% and urban districts maybe 5 to 7%, somewhere in there. And so then, in addition to that, if we take all residential property that's used for Airbnb, VBRO, all those type of things, and we move them to the commercial rate, we'd have additional dollars in here to give relief to other people also. That'd be raised in their class factor from 135 to 1.89. Okay, so then if you take a, just to calculate the numbers, you take a property that's $1 million, okay, the tax on that is gonna go up about $647 and stuff. And so the rebate we're given is gonna be to greater than that. If somebody's got a house that's taxed higher than that, they can elect to have the 110% refund rather than the residential refund that would be a fixed. But by fixing that, we're giving more money to the people with the smaller houses, the people that are, low income, that type of stuff that typically are the smaller. And so we're shifting some money to the lower echelon of people basically that are paying the tax, that don't have the expensive property. So we're doing a little bit of shift that way also within the thing. Then the other thing I think we should consider is we take the residential properties that are above 5 million, raise the rate on them to the class factor to 2.35. Right now, anything over 1.5 is at 189 and stuff. And so that would raise additional money too, that would be able to come through there. And so it'd change all our numbers that we're looking at. But this model would allow us to calculate. That is the key thing. But the thing is the only way we can get some relief is we have to have new money come in. This new money would come from the people that aren't getting the full rebate and stuff. And the process is the county would still bill out the taxes, but the payment would go to the state through the TAP account. And then the state would rebate or would send the money back to the county that didn't belong to the state, just like the county does now. When the county collects, they write a check to the state for the state portion. It'd just be the reverse of that. So it wouldn't be a lot of change there. The biggest thing would be the labor it would take to create the TAP accounts, and then they'd take some oversight to watch that money coming in and making sure it's going to the right places. And so then what we have also in there, if somebody didn't file, this would be filed in your income tax. So you go to your TAP account, your tax preparer could see how much taxable value you had, and then they'd calculate which relief you'd get. And so that would be filed with a return, make it easier for the state to check to make sure that you're filing state return, it's the right percentage, that type of thing. And so that's where I think that it'd work. And then if you don't pay your property tax on time, then you wouldn't qualify for the relief. They'd just be back to the county to collect the delinquent taxes. And same with if you didn't file your income tax return on time, you wouldn't have the relief because you didn't do it. And so I think we can make the process the system work pretty good. Everything's based on taxable value. That's what the county, everything they assess tax on is based on taxable value. So it'd just be a matter from that TAP account being able to pull the taxable value for the people to put on the form to calculate that relief. So you can see where your question in regard to somebody's rental property or a small piece of agricultural land or whatever, they would get the relief under that big block there. Their house, they'd get the 750 or whatever numbers picked, or they'd get the 110% or 115, depend as those numbers get worked through, we'd be able to see what kind of relief there is. But this is just the beginning of the thought process, and it depends on what policy decisions the legislature wanted to make. So any questions from there? I hope that helped clarify a little bit.
Thank you, Dwayne. I have a couple questions if,
Sure.
and it just has to do with the model, so I understand this. So, the additional mills that you say there, are those additional to the 95 mills right now? Is that how I interpret that?
That's correct.
That's how he calculated there, yeah.
Okay, good. Just, it's a matter of definition.
Yeah,
And then my next point is more of an observation. The rebate number you've chosen is probably highly favorable to lower income, fixed income folks, I would think, as a general statement. It's probably not true across the board. Is that your take on it, Dwayne?
yeah, and one of the things when you look at that would be, if you kept the number that high, would you take and look at whether you needed all the other programs you have that reduce taxable value? Okay, the only thing with the reduction in taxable value, it reduced how much the county and the city collect off those properties. You know, but that's, I mean, it's policy stuff. It's just a mechanism to take a look. Is this someplace you'd want to go? There's a lot of things that you could take into those factors.
Thank you. Are there other questions on
This
the
is-
model?
This is Cindy. My question is not on the model so much as the definitions of non-primary residence. Dwayne, you are a thinker. I gotta give you that. Did you include in non-primary residential those farm and ranch homes that are owned by family corporations?
I did not. And the reason for that is those people are already getting a tax break on the income tax system by being able to deduct everything associated with that. And so it'd be their choice as to where it would be the better place to be.
Okay, thanks.
Wayne, I have another, this is Dave. I got another question. On your rebates, another policy decision would be whether you would have some sort of an inflationary adjustment to the rebate if you were to implement a program like this, so you don't have to go back to legislation and increase it as time goes on, as taxable values increase over time. That would seem to be another policy decision that would go into implementing this model.
That's correct. And the other thing you have there, Dave, would be that when the state has excess funds that they want to give back to the taxpayer, like you had the last session, this would be the way you could rebate that back to them along with the income tax.
Okay, thank you. Other questions or comments on this, on the work Dwayne's done here with the Department of Revenue? Well, this is another one where this was intriguing when I first heard it, and and thank you for fleshing it out, Dwayne and Eric, and working so hard on putting this together. If we're going to advance this model, I think you will probably need to, well, I know we'll need to, this is just a calculational model. We'd have to kind of lay out where the policy, where the policy decisions are, and once again, what the overall tax shifts are going to be. So we can see what the net effect is on property taxes going forward. So if we decide to move forward with this, and I see no reason why we shouldn't take some time to develop this idea more fully, we're going to need to add more and more detail and naturally make a few assumptions and do that.
Yeah, I think, and the thing I was gonna do is, now that I got that model, I was gonna run it through the Sam and Nick over and Julia over at the Legislative Fiscal Division, the stuff they've done for Mora. They have some estimates and stuff too that show what they think some of those out-of-state things would be. And so if we look at both those, we can maybe fine tune what that is and it give us a better idea.
Once again, I think beating my tax shift drum here. We need to flesh out exactly where the tax shifts are taking place. And now it may be between property owners that are Montanans versus non-residents as well, and flesh that out just for full transparency. Well, very good. If there are no questions, I think we can continue on with the next topic. And I think I don't have the agenda readily in front of me, but I think this puts Pad back on again. I'm not sure. There we go.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I'm getting my screen shared here. And are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
All right. So the final topic that was requested was some information on increasing school election turnout, especially for voted property tax levies. Here's a very small sample. I'm not aware that there's any sort of statewide repository for this information, so I just grabbed some newspaper articles and a little bit of information on other elections from Secretary of State's website. Reminder that school elections are about a month away on May 7th, so maybe subcommittee members want to kind of keep track of election results and turnout statistics in particular for those elections that are coming up. But you can see that the school elections, at least recently, are ranging from 30 to 50% roughly, whereas you get 80% and 60% at the general elections. A couple possibilities that have been suggested for increasing turnout are: one, you could have levy passage mimic the school bond passage requirements, which I've outlined real briefly here, that are basically, if you have a higher turnout, 40% or more, a simple majority suffices. But when you drop below 40, you need a 60% supermajority. And if turnout is 30% or less, the proposition fails. I will note that those only apply to poll conducted elections, that if election is conducted by mail ballot, it's simple majority again. My impression is that most school elections are mail ballot, but I'm not positive about that either. Mr. Melton may have more info on that. The other possibility would be to move, and this has been looked at a number of times and was last session, would be to move all or most school elections to the November general election in even years. Little more background. What are the voted school levies? You've got the general fund overbase, tech, debt service, which I already addressed. And then in the building reserve, you've got 3 different possible voted levies. You've got kind of the traditional building reserve voted levy to gather money for future construction projects when you know you're going to need a new roof or a new boiler, that kind of thing. School and student safety and security has been added as a voted levy within the building reserve. And then we've got kind of a rarely used transition cost. This has to do with a new school opening or a consolidation situation. Those are your voted levies. Chairman Beatty asked me to see what I could dig up on the background on the May regular school election day, which is the first Tuesday after the first Monday. Trustees are elected. Votes on overbase levy and other levy elections can occur. You can see that in '99, we moved it from first Tuesday of April to first Tuesday in May. And then I was able to dig up, it appears that school elections have always been in the spring, and I was not able to find out any of the why behind that, but it is the end of one school year, the beginning of a next, budget and the attendant budget cycles with that. Kind of a nice reminder that we used to be a whole lot less formal about how we described representation of trustees within the district. Then this is a brief synopsis of what about House Bill 774 and some of it last session. So Rep. Hopkins sponsored this bill, which was going to require that all elections, all local government, school district, et cetera, were held in even number years, either primary or general election day. The bill did not make it, but and Mr. Melton can speak to this much more expertly than I can, but there was a lot of effort among the school groups to say, you know, hold on, there's a way to make this work, but we need to really think carefully about it. And so I give you in the bullet points there kind of the nutshell of what that proposal was. And that was to move all school elections to the November general election in even numbered years, with some limited exceptions that are shown here. Doing that meant you need to change trustee terms from 3 to 4 years and move the board reorganization month from May to January. It allowed moving the budget adoption date up to June from August. It meant with that November election, needing to have a little bit more predictability about voter approved over-based levies, extending a potential duration of those levies to 4 years, and then also allowing those voted levies to increase with the legislature's inflationary adjustments as well. And Mr. Chairman, I think that's the end of my slides, and that's the information I've provided on this topic for you.
Thank you, Pat. Are there any questions for Pat or Mr. Melton? Do you have anything to add?
Mr. Chairman, the one thing that I would want to make sure to add here is that with regard to our work on the election bill, we never got to the point where the gray bill that was out there actually carved out just the school portions that we expressed that we could live with. The gray bill still had all sorts of impacts for counties and cities, and we had no interest in trying to change the law regarding counties or cities, and we repeatedly disclaimed that. But there is a handout, I think, that Pat may have it. It might be uploaded for the committee, but we had an agreement among the Coalition of Advocates for Montana's Public Schools that included both the gray bill and key concepts that would be required for us to be able to support this. And you really do change things substantially from what the votes are about now. The first thing that we did was propose to clear out what we consider to be nitpicky levies, not even levies, decisions that you have to run by the voters that should be within the prerogative of the elected school board. And one of those examples is disposal of property. There's already a loophole in law that you need not go to the voters if the board declares property to be obsolete or unsuitable for school purposes. So there were areas like that where we proposed to remove pinging the voters again and again and again, which is part of the problem. And also sort of a longstanding concern of ours is that the public is led to believe that when the legislature funds schools with a particular percentage, that it means that their budget rises by that particular percentage. And that's not the case. It's the base budget that rises at that particular percentage. And as a result, a 3% increase in the formula equates to a 2.4% increase in the district's base budget. And they have to go to the voters for any local portion that would fulfill what the legislature has approved. The other thing that we've got under the current system, and it has been set in the spring. I was part of when we switched it from April to May and then to June, as we were looking for a greater amount of time before we had to notify teachers of whether they were non-renewed or renewed, and we needed to know the outcome of the elections before we did so. And backing up on top of that, you have to have certified taxable values, at least reasonably at hand. You need to have a sufficient amount of time to forecast based upon your budgeted student count in order to prepare for an August budget adoption. So that's why that deadline has always been in May, and it has been in May or in the spring, because you had to have the exact amount of money that you needed, that you asked the voters for. And if you were to go to an every other year general election, you'd be more asking voter approval for estimated taxes that would be imposed in future years. Changes the whole dynamic of what a local general fund levy election is about. So it's highly complicated. It is not impossible, but it does require pretty extensive changes. And we had those changes mapped out in a gray bill and a 2-page executive summary that is still relevant at this time. And I have discussed this again with the coalition, and on the premise of this still being relevant, as long as we're still talking about the concept of what we had outlined in late May 2023, the school community, or at least the portions represented by the Coalition of Advocates, which includes MASBO, MREA, MTSBA, MQEC, and SAM, are still willing to work on this and are still very concerned about any unintentional impact on counties or cities, which we want to avoid.
Thank you, Lance. Pam, I see your hand is up.
Yeah, so a couple things. Has anyone visited with election administrators? Because when we've had schools come to the county in the past and they've mentioned that they would like the county to take over the school elections, even if they're in May. And it's quite a task to do that with limited staff. I guess that's one question. The other question is, I know if we go to the general election, and I'm pretty sure, I could be wrong, that school district boundaries are different than school district boundaries. Or let's see, school districts and precinct boundaries. So this would require probably a whole nother ballot that we couldn't put on the same ballot as whatever's on the general election. It would be like having 2 elections at the same time. So the cost of that, of course, would have to be absorbed by someone, and hopefully not the counties. So that's just 2 things, the boundaries and then the other thing I mentioned.
Mr. Chairman, if I can answer the first part of that.
Sure.
The election administrators under law as a default are the district clerks, and MASBO's on the Coalition of Advocates for Montana's Public Schools. We specifically declined to change any law that would require the counties to assume the elections. The current law says that school districts may ask, and the county may say yes or no. And if the county says yes, then the school district pays, and the county administers, and the county election administrator takes over the role of both the Board of Trustees and the district clerk. So we chose specifically not to require the assumption of the responsibility for administering elections by the county officials, and left the law in place as it exists right now, as I've just described it.
Thank you, Lance. So let's remember why we're even entertaining this particular option at this point, and that is concern that was expressed that we are making significant property tax decisions in low turnout elections. So one option was to move, school elections to an election time that has high turnouts. So that's the general election. But the other option that Pat spoke of earlier was to incorporate in school mill levy elections language that is akin to what you find already existing for bonds. As a matter of fact, I would suggest, after looking at the bond language, that might be modified as well, so that approval was tied to, in some way to the approval threshold was tied to the turnout, as is the case now for bond elections. To answer Pam's question concerning talking to election officials, if we decide to pursue moving the school elections in November, we absolutely must coordinate with the clerks and recorders or school election officials. So that my question to the group now, well, let me just say my take on this now is the most doable way going forward is to take a look at turnout thresholds on the existing school election dates and leave the school elections where they are right now because of the possibility of unintended consequences. So I would actually I'm contemplating advocating for limiting this school election turnout to digging deeper into turnout thresholds for school elections rather than moving school elections. Lance.
Mr. Chairman, I would just respectfully express our disagreement with that concept. And I know that does not matter either way. I just want to make sure that we're on record as being concerned about incentivizing people staying home and killing necessary school levy elections that are integrated into the formula as a necessary part of ensuring adequacy. And I think that we would have grave concerns, and I think you'll eventually, not by us necessarily, I'm not saying that, but I think eventually there is fertile grounds for a legal challenge over those kinds of constructs in terms of what that means for qualified electors under the Montana Constitution, as well as the concept of popular sovereignty and even potentially adequacy itself. If the result is levy elections fail with increasing frequency, the districts cannot offer the quality education defined in law at a base budget level. For the most part, the average school district is at 97% of maximum, and I believe we've got 130 plus districts that are over maximum right now. And so if over time, repeated failure of levy elections simply by apathy could really threaten the constitutionality of the formula.
Thank you, Lance. And let me respond to you in a couple of ways. First of all, you're my favorite education lawyer to talk to. You raise an excellent point about the fact that we're statewide. We're at about 97% of the cap amount, and certainly that is a data point that ought to concern the 2025 decennial study group. I get that much. Let me so I'm going to acknowledge that, and you make a good point. But in terms of if we were to apply similar turnout language to mill levy elections as we do to bond elections, are you suggesting that the requirements on bonds elections is also constitutionally suspect as it stands right now?
Mr. Chairman, yes, I would.
Okay.
I think there are concerns if we and I'm not telling you that's not like some sort of a legal opinion. I'm just telling you that the concepts in the Constitution that protect the role of qualified electors having a comparable vote to one another. If someone who shows up has less of a say in the outcome of that levy than someone who stays home and does not cast a vote at all, that's the crux of the issue as to whether you have qualified electors being treated disparately based upon either their apathy or their opposition or their support for a levy that's placed before the voters.
Well, thank you. So any other comments or questions on this subject area, school election turnout? Let me put another question to the group. Is there anyone here that thinks we should abandon this entire effort in school election turnout? And if there's enough hands that go up here amongst the committee members, then we'll take this off the plate. So I see if Pam's hands up, it's either to talk or to tell me, take it off the plate. So let's make this easy. Raise your hand if you want to take this off the plate. Well, I'm convinced, Sandra, I'd see that you would like to continue working on this. Okay, based upon the informal poll we took here, we are going to put this, we're going to put the school election turnout thing on the back burner. We may find that the committee as a whole wants to have more action taken on this, but I'm willing to report out that based upon our evaluation of this is not a fruitful way to go forward. All right, what's next on the agenda?
Mr. Chairman, I believe we are at the public comment portion, if I'm not mistaken.
Perfect. Let us have public comment then.
And same procedure, if you do have a public comment, we'd ask that you raise the hand and we can get you admitted into the conversation here.
I see Bob Story is on and has his hand raised.
I am. Am I on the audio now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Very good. Well, thank you for another great informational meeting. You covered a lot of ground again today. I'm going to try to hit some of the things I've had some questions or comments about. On the district, the first part of your program on school districts and administrative efficiency and that kind of thing. You know, I think if I'm correct, the last legislature allowed students to travel to schools that they thought they might want to go to if the school would take them, and then the A and B money follows them there, or the tuition money, or however that's going to work. And I think it is more student choice in the public system becomes available, and the students start matriculating to schools that have programs that they want, and probably more on the high school level than the elementary level, but that might begin to solve some of the district number of district problems as students leave them, but there's still the problems, I think, of unifying boundaries to get to a K-12 district when you have those elementary districts that have different boundaries than the high school district. And I don't know, maybe someone who's more familiar with those statutes than I am might take a look at that and see if there's needs to be something done to make it easier for those boundaries to be unified, and then you could get to the K-12 district. I found the discussion about county equalization of base aid interesting, because if you read the statutes we've been discussing for the last several months, 29, 331 and 333, that's what those were. They were county equalization statutes till the money started going to the state. The language never changed in the statutes that money is supposed to be used for county equalization, and then any excess goes to the state. So maybe you don't really need to reinvent that horse. Maybe you need to look at those statutes if that's what you wanted to do. And I'm sure there would be some opposition to that also, but use those statutes for your model for countywide equalization and how that would work. And then you would need to do something differently with your statewide equalization mills to get the revenue probably, but that's again what those two statutes were originally, that's the way they originally operated up until some point in time, and I don't know what point in time they changed. And finally, on district, maybe, I guess, districts are there, some out of geographical necessity, quite a few of them probably, but some of them, as has been pointed out, are there for tax purposes. Maybe you'd need to look at putting more weight on the A and B part of the formula and less weight on the base entitlement. And that would squeeze, as districts lost students, that would squeeze their ability to operate, because that base entitlement, especially in elementary districts, is, you know, pretty near enough to hire a teacher. So might be something to look at. The GTB anomaly issue, I think you guys covered that pretty well, but the thing about that anomaly is it wasn't a statewide anomaly. It was a regional anomaly. And so there were a lot of places in Montana that didn't have a spike in values because of reappraisal of residential and commercial property. And so again, as has been pointed out many times, in everything you do when the state of Montana, when you try to fix something on a statewide basis, you have winners and losers, and the GTB anomaly is one of those. I expect that most of the effect was in the large districts in the cities where the lag caught them harder probably than it did some other places, but I didn't have Lance's spreadsheet where I could see it, so that probably shows some of the answers to that. When you were talking about the equalization mill income, or the presentation that showed you how 587 House Bill 587 works, I think Mr. Melton explained that pretty well. I mean, we were basically collecting growth and revenue on the 95 mills, and I think we shouldn't even be doing analysis on 79 mills anymore. I think that's a straw man out there. Just forget about doing any analysis on that. That's not where the law is or the court decision is, but you probably should look at a floating 95 mills instead of a floating 79 mills, because that's going to be somewhere between a fixed 95 mills and the fixed 79 mills on Julia's charts. And, you know, assuming the 95 doesn't become a fixed levy, it's going to eventually float when the bank mills run out. So you probably should have that, should be a line on the chart, and take the 79 mil lines off of there, because those are not instructive for much of anything. I don't view you're never going to drop down there in the next reappraisal cycle. You know, the mills might calculate out to 90 mills or something like that. I would guess we're not going to see a 47% increase in residential property next time. And as far as the graphs Julia was showing on the growth and revenue on all of the, well, especially the floating levies, I don't know if you're counting for newly taxable property in there or not. That's significant in statewide and in some districts. I was just doing some research this week on that issue, and I think DOR is going to put some data together for the committee, the local government committee that meets tomorrow. But Gallatin County had $40 million in taxable value increase of newly taxable property, not market increase, taxable value increase. And the state of Montana had $200 million in taxable value increase just from newly taxable property. So you put 95 mills to $200 million, that's, you know, $19 million in new revenue in the equalization mills. And so you have to account for that on top of the half of the rate of inflation that's in statute. And hopefully that was in those charts, but but I don't know that. On Eric Dale's model for Mr. Iverson, it would be nice, I think, to have another column on that when you get down into those other classes of property to show what the mill increase generates in revenue from those classes of property. It's going to be significant in some of them. And I think the political problem that you may run into is apportioning the rebate according to their apportioned income in Montana, because I was looking at the railroad and airlines who are protected by federal law from unequal taxation, and they might be protected on the rebate side too. I don't know. But they're going to pay significant tax under that, and they're going to get about 6% of their money back. I would guess it might be a similar thing with Montana Dakota Utilities and Northwest Energy on their electric distribution systems, because those are all multi-state corporations, and so they might pay $20-30 million in new taxes and get 15 of it back. So the other 15 is going to go on your electric bill. Some of those kind of things to think about in that whole scenario. But in the end, anytime you increase the statewide levies, like has been explained, if you go to 110 mills on the current equalization levy, you're basically going to be taking money out of certain areas and shifting it mostly back into where the students are, which is a large district. I think Lance mentioned he had a model that kind of showed where how that happens. So that'll be interesting to see. And finally, the election issue, I guess you're going to drop it, but maybe the first thing to try is just put return postage on the mail out ballots and see if you get more of them back. I don't know, why people don't return them. I would guess again that most school elections are mail ballot elections, and the data that Pad showed you from the returns, again, we don't know if some of those were mail elections or if all those were vote in person elections or whatnot, but that might be something just the legislature should look at, as if there's not a repository at the Secretary of State's office on turnout on all elections, maybe there ought to be one. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Story. Is there any other public comment? I don't see any. Is there any online? Well, I guess everything is online, come to speak of it. Unless someone's sitting in my house with me now, and there is no one here in this room that has it seeks to make comment. Hey, thank you very much for a very excellent and informative meeting. I want to thank our staff for all the work they've done getting ready here. Pat, Julia, Eric, and others unnamed that are essential for us to do our work. I'm not going to rehearse what we accomplished today. I think that there's sufficient, we got sufficient information to further develop a number of options. We'll set school election turnout at least on the table for now, and I look forward to seeing where the details as we flesh out each of these options. On behalf of the committee, I will arrange to meet with staff sometime early next week just to rehash this meeting and make sure that that we have a path forward. I anticipate that we'll meet again in about a month, date to be determined, and I will report out to the full advisory council when we meet again, which I believe is the 22nd of April. Ryan, do you have anything to add before we adjourn?
No, Mr. Chairman, that's a good summary. I was just going to add that the 22nd, for folks that don't know, is the tentative right now date. Again, that afternoon, 1 o'clock. So certainly look forward to, discussing anything in the meantime. And Mr. Chairman, I'll await your phone call here.
Thank you. Is there any, if there's no other comment from members of the committee, I'm looking for hands now. we'll go ahead and adjourn this meeting. I want to thank everybody who put effort into this. And by the way, I should call out Mr. Iverson as well for all the work he's doing on the what I've coined as the Iverson option. Very well. Take care, and we shall see you probably by Zoom on the 22nd of April.
Can I just add that the 22nd meeting is in the OBPP conference room, 250.
Excellent. So those of us that can travel there may do so. There will be a Zoom option as well.
Correct.
Okay, any other comments from anyone? In that case, this meeting is adjourned. Take care.